and that when you design for control, implicitly, you're designing out the opportunity for easy change. Admittedly, the structure requires some periodic modification, but because it's not designed for easy change, that comes across as a disjointed or a disruption to that stability. And that's the heart of our problem. But it also brings to a question that too often we do not ask ourselves. What if? What if we designed the organization for change and not for control? And that's kind of an interesting question that we rarely ask. But when you ask it, you start to think about what is control, how is it done, and how can it be done? And it really opens up the bigger challenge of what are our assumptions that we routinely do without question. It also brings up the broader question of control relative to controlling the present and controlling the future. This gets into the issue of you manage or control the present, but you lead change for the future. And too often we try to do that within the same structure, but what ends up happening is that the present firefighting takes up so much time that rarely do we get around to thinking about changing for the future until that future necessity becomes a crisis in the present and we're forced into a reaction for the change. This then gets to the heart then of how do you split the present control from the future control. This also opens up the issue of control that is distributed across the organization versus control that is delegated. As we talked about in the earlier presentation this morning, the traditional hierarchy focuses on delegating control down into the organization, where some of the networks and alternate structures that have a network built behind the traditional hierarchy, some of that control is distributed outside of the traditional hierarchy itself. So we have seen that it is possible. The challenge then is how do you design to make that happen easily? This gets to where we were this morning. What can we learn from the non-traditional structures? We've seen what works, but in all cases we examined, none of them were without at least some problems. We looked at Sociocracy, Cotter's dual operating system, Nucor, Gore, and Hire. All had great benefits in the way they organize themselves, but none were perfect. But collectively, when you look at all of them, you can see the nuggets and put together all the pieces that make something better than each one individually. We also get into then what is control for the present versus the future. And that gets into different orders of control. For example, think about a thermostat, which is a first order control. You're controlling the temperature, say at 72 degrees. Based upon the room temperature, the furnace or air conditioner turns on and off. That is controlling the present. Second and third order control is not being done at that level. Second order control is you deciding what the thermostat setting should be. That becomes a planning function that requires a separate thought and separate process. Or should we even control the thermostat? Or should we control the heat and air conditioning by opening and closing windows? Or should we use a gas or electric furnace or a geothermal heat pump? There's a number of issues that are very, very different than when you take a look at future control, which gets into the second and third order types of control. Going back then as what did we learn from these non-traditional structures that can be generalized into a new design process? First was that autonomy is possible. All of these organizations with networks are very successful in distributing decision-making across the organization, but it comes with the necessity of alignment. And the alignment comes through the control process of a traditional hierarchy naturally. And that's one of the reasons why the hierarchy is so control oriented. It's trying to do an alignment process without parts of the organization flying off in different directions. So when you distribute decision making, you also have to put some tension against that going too out of whack, and that comes through alignment. So there is a challenge then of autonomy and purpose, and that requires the alignment across the organization. The network structures do work successfully. We've seen that, but they also require some support. That support comes either through an alignment process or in many cases, a learning curve, such as Sociocracy, that has a very high learning curve in the way they facilitate and document meetings and how they make decisions around the decision criteria or decision rights within certain parts of the organization. But it is possible, and we've seen that there are examples of how to do that. We've also seen in these examples that accountability is possible and comes naturally when you work with small units. Small units that are directly connected have the accountability built into those connections, and you're no longer pushing problems up the organization and then possibly across and down into correlated silos. So by having the direct connections, you're eliminating much of the conflict within silos and building accountability at the same time. You're also building more direct communication without filtering. Filtering not only going up the organization, but filtering going down the organization of what is communicated and how that communication is spun relative to the politics within the organization. We've also seen what we're calling an entrepreneurial spirit is possible. This is how to be more flexible, more responsive, more agile, any number of terms that you can use relative to keeping the organization moving rapidly without getting caught up in the bureaucracy that comes when the decision-making is delegated and not distributed. Okay. Going forward then, how can this be done? This is where we now need to start turning into the design elements. We've looked at this from the principles of structure and principles of operations. We now need to flip around to how do you design an organization to do that. And again, we're talking about an organization that is designed to be proactive and handle change routinely and adaptively.